Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week on The Final Straw, we're sharing an interview we conducted in recognition of the upcoming celebration of June 11th, International Day of Solidarity, with Marius Mason and other long-term anarchist prisoners. This week, you'll hear Julie Herrada, a longtime anarchist activist, comrade of Marius Mason, and worker in the Labadie Collection at the University of Michigan. Julie is joined by Matthew Hart, another longtime anarchist involved in labor organizing, historical research with the Dockstadter Mutual Aid Society, as well as the Los Angeles Anarchist Black Cross chapter of the Federation. We speak about history, memory, prisoner support, and continuing the struggles. If you'd like to hear more about the history of June 11th and voices of anarchist prisoners and those who support them outside, we've taken the opportunity on The Final Straw each year to have at least one show focusing on specific cases or concepts related to ongoing struggle and anti-repression work, which can be found easily by searching June 11 on our website, or you can follow the links in the show notes. But first up, you'll hear a comrade reading the 2024 call from June 11th entitled No Separate Worlds. And if you're interested in getting involved in local June 11th events where you're at, you can check out june11.noblogs.org or itsgoingdown.org for lists of local events. A quick announcement before we start the show. There's a fundraiser for the family of Cherokee anarchist prisoner Oso Blanco, as they've recently suffered a house fire that destroyed their home. You can find more information about this, as well as where to donate, at gofundme.com by searching for Help Political Prisoner Family Cherokee Rebuild After Fire.
We once again approach June 11th, a day of remembrance and active solidarity. June 11th, 2024. No separate worlds. In a world of multiple crises and struggles for liberation, all of these are interconnected. There are no separate worlds. Across borders, languages, contexts, and identities, both catastrophes and victories of spirit and defiance reverberate around the globe. One environment is not untouched by another. The personal is not separate from the political. The positive project is not separate from that of destruction. Prison is not separate from the free world. Means are not separate from ends. Bridging these divides is a shared curiosity and commitment. Bridging these divides is solidarity. This is not to flatten or oversimplify diversity and differences in circumstance, intensity, and consequence. Rather, that these different pieces are held together like organs of the body held by connective tissue. So we consider, how do we strengthen this connective tissue? How do we remain strong, yet supple and flexible? Bridges, connection, must also be built through time, especially in a world that moves too fast from one crisis to the next. June 11th aspires to be one of those bridges, to build solidarity across borders, between movements, and among generations. Remembering and supporting long-term prisoners, as well as carrying on shared struggles, are two ways to strengthen this connective tissue. A stronger connective tissue will, in turn, bolster us against further repression. Each year, as part of our effort to be a bridge between movements, time, and borders, we assess the terrain. We consider what threats from the state look like at this time, how imprisoned comrades can be connected to activity on the outside, how have the struggles they are part of continued despite repression, and how remembering those locked up can become a natural part of anarchist activity. Often repression and criminalization feel new, but frequently this is a failure of memory. There are innovations to pay attention to. While seeing their lineage and tactics and ideologies used against our forebears, what can we learn from how people have responded in the past? What can we learn from people in times and places where innovative repressive tactics were deployed? And how can we act in complicity alongside them? As the Day of Solidarity nears, we are struck by the unfolding of the current terrain. The horrors abound, and confront us in new ways. But there are also patterns and histories in repetition. Power is scrambling to maintain itself amidst the uncertainty of our fragilely constructed society, and individuals and groups continue on with our refusal of their world. We see continued colonial violence through prisons, guns, bombs, and nationalist ideologies in places such as Palestine, Ukraine, and West Papua. 2. Extremely harsh treatments of people in Russia acting against militarism and colonialism, as well as criminalization of pro-Palestine activity all over the world. Palestinians, fighting for their freedom and against policing, surveillance, and detention for decades, have faced an all-out criminalization of violence and genocide at the hands of the Israeli state. Crisis and colonial violence continue to rapidly unfold. So, too, does an intense current of Palestinian resistance. Solidarity actions have taken place across the globe in attempts to refuse complicity and the feelings of powerlessness fueled by the geographical distance, the 24-hour news cycle, and the propaganda and war machines that abound. As people continue to flee their regions due to capitalist and imperialist-made violence and the catastrophic consequences of climate collapse, we are witnessing a renewed fear-mongering at U.S. and European borders as white supremacist militias murmur about confronting migrant caravans, and individual states implement a greater level of violence to keep people out of artificial borders. This crisis extends throughout the globe, as people worldwide move to eke out any stability, and others rush to enforce the promised order of borders and citizenship. Colonial violence springs up daily, in guns drawn and territory stolen, in extraction projects and the expansion of policed land, and in the loss of the last wild spaces. But resistance to a homogeneous and hollow future being sold to us by tech giants, green capitalists, and the state still continues across the world. Pipelines, cell towers, and extraction infrastructure is being targeted both in individual sabotage as well as ongoing land defense worldwide. The dependence on this noxious future on policing, surveillance, and control couldn't be clearer, and struggles are confronting the ways these practices interact. Rebellions break out against police, prisons, and the indignity and macabre realities of daily life. For every crisis and moment of resistance we could list, there are countless others simmering, exploding, or simply being disappeared from the public, global view. Freedom and resistance always find their way through the cracks of this horrifying society. Public food serves being harassed, heightened criminalization of houseless populations, RICO charges for bail funds, and the conspiracy of anarchist ideas and practices, as well as proximity, associations, and social networks. Intense and courageous acts of sabotage continue. Everything is new, and nothing is. The question is not, what are the solutions, but how do we expand, deepen, and intensify what we already know works? How do we see ourselves and one another? How do we understand our plights as intertwined, as inseparable? And how can we continue to expand these relationships of solidarity? How do we embrace the reality that there are no separate worlds, and explores the ways that we can break through the limiting effects of prison walls, border walls, time, place, and context? There are moments worth celebrating when we feel the opening of possibilities and capacity, of cohesion and strength. There are certain also many moments to mourn, when it feels like we're losing it all and our bodies or spirits are taking a beating. We can savor a touch of solace when we notice the deep desperation apparent in the moves of the state. They're scrambling, finding new ways to criminalize even the most basic of acts. This can serve to motivate us. If anything even vaguely anarchist is enough to throw us to the helm of repression, we must choose to live our lives as we decide, regardless of the consequences. As more and more of us interact with repression, jails, courts, prisons, let this possibility be a never-ending invitation towards continuing to remember and include those locked away as an ongoing part of our moves towards getting free. Time, geography, the barriers of the prison wall, none of these are strong enough to obliterate the vast network of bridges that keep us interdependent, connected, fighting the same enemies of freedom worldwide. This year we saw the passing of many who carried the vivacious anarchist spirit. Some may be known to us, while many remain unknown. They sowed rebelliousness in every path they walked. Perhaps their impact is incalculable, though never non-existent. We can carry the same spirit, traverse similar paths, and remain steadfast and diligent, just as those who have come before us. Rest in power, Alfredo Bonanno, Cleve Benally, Ed Mead, Sekou Odinga, Tortuguita, Aaron Bushnell. Rest in power to all those whose names we've never uttered, not known, but who walk these links nonetheless. Time is merely constructed. Those that have come before us and passed on to death still impact the lives of the living, still contribute to the history of anarchists and anti-authoritarians and our shared struggle. Let us make them a part of our active memory and continue forward in a fight for lives against domination. May these words spark a fire in you, encourage you to get up, forge ahead, and seek what it might feel like to live like you are trying to get free.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
Let's start with you all introducing yourselves, names, pronouns, or whatever else you'd like to mention about who you are and what you do and maybe how you relate to this conversation, either in terms of anti-repression work, in terms of a longer memory of anarchism, that sort of stuff.
Sure. Hi, I'm Julie Herrada, and I'm based in Southeast Michigan, from Detroit originally. I've been working with the Joseph A. Labadie Collection of radical social protest movements for the past 30 years, which is part of the University of Michigan. And that collection has its foundation in anarchism going back to the mid-19th century and all the way up to the present, but covers a lot of other social movements as well. I'm also support person for Marius Mason, who's been in prison since about 2008 on charges of eco-terrorism. And I've known Marius since the late 1980s, so we go back a long way in Detroit doing direct action and environmental justice activities together, as well as anarchist stuff. I've been involved in a lot of different movements around anarchism, as well as political prisoner movements and capital punishment stuff and environmental justice, anti-racist stuff, and definitely against anti-choice movements, the right wing, and especially against Planned Parenthood in the 1980s, when there were a lot of clinic defenses, and I was on the front lines with a lot of people helping women get access to their healthcare needs. I think that's about it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Matt Hart, pronouns he, him. I've been involved in the anarchist movement since the mid-1990s. Was originally got involved in Food Not Bombs, but then quickly got involved in the Anarchist Black Cross, joined the Federation probably about a year after our chapter was formed. Over the years, I've been involved in doing political prisoner support, but also been involved in IWW, was early on in my activism, got involved in the labor movement, was involved in the Southern California grocery strike in 03-04, which lasted about 141 days. Ever since then, I've been primarily involved in doing political prisoner work and labor. I've also had a passion in labor history, or an anarchist history, and trying to uncover the anarchist and radical history in Los Angeles. And a few years ago started what was originally called the Black Rose Historical Society, but is now called the Dockstadter Mutual Aid Organization, that named after one of our former anarchists that passed away in the early 2000s, a gentleman by the name of Seth Dockstadter, who was an activist in the area since the 1980s. A lot of what I do is about labor education. Also teach locally at a community college called LA Trade Tech, particularly in labor, various things along labor, whether it's labor education, grievance and arbitration, contract negotiations, and my day work is working for a labor union. And that's about it.
Thanks, Matt. So we're here today talking about June 11th, the International Day of Solidarity with Long-Term Anarchist Prisoners. What's specific about June 11th is the long term. It's about longevity, and so it's about memory. What is your understanding of anarchist memory, and why is it important? What are some aspects that might be different from other types of memory?
I guess I'll go first. I think that, the anarchist movement is not a mainstream movement, so it's a little bit harder to keep that memory going because it doesn't see, the light of day as far as mainstream archives. As part of my work at the Labadie Collection is to find those voices and make sure that they're preserved and made accessible.
Yeah, just thinking about, what is specific about anarchist memory compared to other types of memory, and why is it important to maintain our history?
Yeah, because nobody else is going to do it. And at least they're not going to do it honestly and with integrity. So, it is up to us to keep those voices and also hold those historic movements so that people in the future can have access to them and understand them better. A lot of people don't understand that there is a lot of the work that they're doing now was done like decades ago. And things happen so fast these days that people don't have time to look back and reflect. And that's the importance of keeping those voices and keeping that history.
Yeah, and I think along that, when I was originally thinking about this question, I found it very interesting because reflecting on this question, I'm not sure if we have an anarchist memory per se. I mean, obviously we have certain moments and individuals that we oftentimes remember. But I think in terms of that long history, I'm not sure if as a movement we really particularly have that. I know that there are individuals like Paul Averick and David Struthers, Kenyon Zimmer, and obviously the work that Julie does. We've got those individuals who try to bring that history out into the open. But I think a lot of times that history is oftentimes sort of covered up through time. I think one of the examples that I can kind of recall just in Los Angeles is that there was a time where after a protest, we were walking past a building called the Italian Hall. And I just kept on thinking, this building, I know this name. I don't know why I know this building. I don't know why. And I started looking through some of my books at home, discovered that this location was during the 19-teens, 1920s, and even to some degree in the 1920s more so, but found that this was a center for a lot of the Italian anarchists, the Magonista movement, and that just north of that, the whole Magonista movement was vibrant in that community and in that space. But the anarchist community here in Los Angeles had no understanding of where the Magonista movement was active, the fact that here, right where we have La Placita, which is down with the center of where Los Angeles was built, just a few yards away, we had this space that was once the home of the anarchist movement, and that none of us even knew about it. And even when I got involved in the movement, names like Ricardo Flores Magón or Anselmo Figueroa or Maria Talavera, who were very important figures in the anarchist movement in Los Angeles, especially the Southwest, the very fact that these were people that were part of our community and had developed had struggled in the same spaces in which we stand, this was not information that was really, really, really discovered or unearthed. We knew that Ricardo Flores Magón lived in Los Angeles, but the very fact that the whole movement at one point was centered here in Los Angeles, or that we had a vibrant Jewish anarchist community or a vibrant Italian anarchist community, for a lot of us in Los Angeles, this was something that wasn't known. So, when I think about the concept of anarchist history and sort of our relationship to it, again, I think we certainly know Haymarket, Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, but in terms of that real tangible history, that sort of broad history, I think oftentimes those things are lost in time, with the exception of people, again, like Julie and David Struthers and other folks who have worked over the years to unearth it. So I think in terms of its importance, I do think it's important because I think that we need to understand where our movement has been, the struggles, the significance of our movements, how our movement has transcend through various aspects of society, and how it's still relevant today, even like the Ricardo Flores Magón movement. The one community that brought Ricardo Flores Magón and the Magonista movement to life was not the anarchist movement, but was the Chicano movement in the 1960s. And so here we have this history of the Latino community, the anarchist community, all coming together in Los Angeles, it being unearthed by another movement, the Chicano movement here in Los Angeles. And I think that, again, it just shows our connection to different spaces and different communities. And I think that's one of the importances. I think that's an important aspect of why we need to uncover the sort of our history and who we are, because I do think that it reaches out into other aspects of society, whether it's, these civil rights movements that are building, these power movements that are building, or even things like the labor movement. We can see a lot of overlap when we start unearthing our history.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that I think that, we tend to rely on these, individuals. I'm thinking people like Bob Helms who has a passion for history, not necessarily historian or academic or, anybody that's, formally trained, but yet they have a passion because they're anarchists and because they love history. And we rely on them to kind of tease out some of these stories and share them. And they don't get shared widely enough, but yet they are documented. So, those are the ones that I gravitate toward, people whose research I trust and, who have a passion for it.
And I think kind of jumping on what Julie said, Robert is such an amazing resource. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting about the community of those people who are very, very passionate about that history is how oftentimes we build relationships with each other and help each other unearth a lot of that information. I know certainly he and I have shared a lot of information about anarchists that have come from Philadelphia and have come over to Los Angeles, and we've worked with each other in trying to share that information to sort of unearth it to the best of our ability. He's one individual that is definitely an amazing resource.
So I've had several conversations recently that have made me realize how quickly we lose memory within and among struggles and movements, much like we're talking about. On a shorter scale even, in my own time, there will be people organizing around an issue of no idea that anyone ever tried this before and how it went, but it was only like 5 years before that we did something similar. I'm sure a lot of people have seen similar things in their places. I wonder what y'all's sense of this is and what we can do about just that short-term longevity and interconnection between, can't say generations because it's only, again, in this example, like 5 years, but what it is about the lack of continuity on a short scale and how we communicate with new folks coming in.
Well, I find this happens a lot in my work because, one, I'm old, so I have memory of movements going back, 40 years and more. But also I work in an archive that goes back 150 to close to 200 years. So I'm exposed to historical movements constantly. And it strikes me how the feeling of this is a critical moment in our history and things are falling apart and what are we going to do and wringing our hands never goes away. Like people always feel that way going back hundreds of years. And so I have to kind of step away from that feeling, that critical, that hype that goes on now, that everything is, falling apart and this is the end of days and all that. Because I see it in other movements, historical movements. And it is frustrating to see, that there's no connection to history. And one thing I've been trying to do is bring out some of those historical movements just a little bit at a time. Like I post flyers and images on the Facebook page for the Labadie Collection using something like the Certain Days calendar or Autonomedia. I go to the calendar. Okay, what happened on this day in history and what do we have from our collection that I can show people that this happened? And so I've been trying to do a little bit more of that just because there's so much in the archive and there's no way that I could kind of tackle any one project in a big way. So, that's something that I think everybody who knows about these historical movements can really kind of help do something about. And if you talk to people and you can tell them, this isn't the first time this happened. And there is information, there is a place you can go to find out about it.
I think for me, one of the things that I've done over the years that's been somewhat useful is walking tours. Again, to sort of step back from my statement earlier, Los Angeles, oftentimes our history is forgotten. And I don't think that we're the only town where a lot of our movement's history has been forgotten. I think there are some cities that are probably are able to obtain that history a lot more effectively than places like Los Angeles, because we tend to build over and build up. But one of the things that I thought has always been useful is understanding the connection between the past and where we're standing. And so things like walking tours, especially around walking tours in our communities, remind us that, this history, this movement is part of where we stand today, is part of the streets that we navigate. And I think oftentimes it not only changes our relationship to that history, but also changes our perspective towards the landscape in which we're walking through. Using again that example, that Italian hall, we've built off of that. And, one of the tours that we do is through an area in Los Angeles called Chinatown that at one point was Sonora Town and Little Italy. And so we have, as part of that, a conversation of how spaces and communities have shifted over the years and have an explanation as to why that is. And so it, again, has us having a better understanding of our community. It has a better understanding of our history as a city, as a movement, as the spaces that we sort of navigate through. And I think it has we begin to develop a greater sense, a historical sense of self in our communities. But kind of going back to the idea of, seeing things being reinvented every 5 years, or seeing movements sort of reemerge, not really seeing its history. It's one of those sort of weird fine lines, because you also don't want to be that person that, steps in and says back in my day, because nobody really wants to hear that. But I do think that it is important to, have those conversations of, hey, look at, this is wonderful that this is being created. Are you aware that, this was something that, existed previously here? And, as an example of that, the city that I live in is outside of Los Angeles, but it has an interesting, vibrant history of anarchism since the late 80s. And so every once in a while, we will see, young anarchists organizing in our community. And so one of the things that we try to do is try to find ways in which we can support them without necessarily being the old men that are sitting there saying, oh, back in the day we did this, but trying to find ways in which we can actually support them in the work that they're doing now, offer advice if given, but we're there to support, we're not there to storytell. And so that's one of the things that we try to do, and we try to be very conscious of, is, not being the old folks in the corner that are, reminiscing about the good old days, but trying to find ways to build tangible support for the community that's coming up.
Yeah, I love those walking tours that have been created around different cities. In fact, once I had a walking tour with Paul Average in 1997. He took me for a walking tour around the Lower East Side, just me and him. And he pointed out all the old anarchist haunts, Emma Goldman's apartments, places where she published the Mother Earth magazine, places where people lectured, marched, rallied, Tompkins Square, Cooper Union, Webster Hall. I mean, it was amazing, and it really had an effect on me. And I love when other people take up those projects and do them in cities around the country. The problem with that is that you have to be in a city to be part of a radical walking tour. And a lot of people aren't necessarily in cities where they can walk around and, think about what happened here in history. So yeah, there's all kinds of different ways to bring out these histories, and walking tours are certainly fun, and they're definitely hard to sustain, but I'd like to see more of those.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is interesting about walking tours is, and one of the things that, for those that are looking at doing that, the one thing that I'll caution is also have an understanding about space and respecting space. because, one of the areas that's the most vibrant community, or at least vibrant history of anarchism in Los Angeles is, for example, Boyle Heights. It has a rich, rich, rich history of both the anarchist movement, the Jewish anarchist movement, and the Latino anarchist movement. But right now, we've got a huge struggle around issues of gentrification. And so, you certainly, if you're thinking about doing something like that as a way to draw that connection, you want to make sure that you're respectful of the communities that are there now, and making sure that you're not part of the problem while you're trying to unearth the history and trying to connect certain communities with their history, while at the same point being a problem with another community in terms of the current community and the struggles that they have around gentrification. So one thing that I do want to throw out is, at least if you're thinking about doing something like that, at least be respectful of the communities that are there, and how what you're trying to do may be helpful or maybe a hindrance to what's going on currently. And also, Julie, anytime you ever want to do a LA history tour and you're in the town, let me know. I'll be more than happy to.
Thank you.
I was just kind of thinking in response to this, in terms of the small town that I live in, there's a small city, that even if, for me, there's a project called Hood Huggers that gives a history of Black organizing and Black neighborhoods around the city of Asheville that in a lot of cases don't exist or look vastly different. And so that brings in the conversation of gentrification and redlining and Jim Crow, and makes it very material for folks that are on the tour, as well as the tour redistributing money from people that are paying for the tour back into Black businesses. I think, even if you're not in a place that has had a history of vibrant anarchist organizing, this sort of materializing or concretizing or whatever, the resistance to similar institutions and organization methods of repression as capitalism, racial capitalism, settler colonialism, that kind of models a really interesting way to make those conversations vibrant and alive in the minds of people that are taking the tour. And plus a nice opportunity to do a little digging into the history of the place that you live in. Because even if you're anywhere in the US, there's a good chance there's been a Klan chapter, and there's a good chance that there's been people fighting it. That's a good conversation starter right there, I think.
The other thing that I wanted to point out is you can really get a sense of what cities' commitment to history is when you do a walking tour and there's nothing left. And I did that. It wasn't a walking tour. It was more of a driving tour with Carlotta Anderson, who wrote the biography of Joseph Labadie in the late 1990s. And she came to town, and we went on a tour around Detroit and picked out all of the places that Joe Labadie hung out or had his network and community spaces and all that. And she had exact addresses and everything, and there was nothing left of any of the buildings or spaces from that time period. And that was probably, that was 1998 when we did that tour. And so it's even worse now because Detroit has been badly gentrified in the last 10 or 15 years. So that was pretty depressing.
Kind of going back on that issue of, trying to find the very fact that you may not have anarchist history, but you may have history around social justice or, issues of institutional racism in your city, and, at least being aware of that. It kind of reminds me of, fairly recent, a couple years ago, I wrote a piece about the history of the Klan in my city, in the city that I live in, and how Richard G. Butler, who was the head of Aryan Nation, built a lot of his politics while living in the city that I live in, and how there's this very deep root of historical, institutional, structural racism, racial movements in our society that have this relationship with the city I live in, including eugenics. And what was funny was the city I live in is the image is a small Quaker town, so there's all these implications related to that. But the reaction that I got from the community was outrage over the fact that I was trying to soil the imagery of the city in which we live in, even though all of this is historically accurate. But the outrage of the fact that there was an attempt to somehow besmirch or put a blemish on the city's image, it was very eye-opening to me in terms of working to uncover that history, putting that history out there, and then seeing the blowback and seeing the reaction of it, I think was very, very interesting for me when that all took place.
I love how y'all have connected these questions of memory and history to place. That seems like such an important element of how that continues to be present in our lives, or how Julie mentioned sometimes it isn't present anymore, and that in itself is something to notice. And Julie, I'm glad you mentioned Emma Goldman, because last year I was reading her autobiography, Living My Life with a Few Friends, and that's actually kind of what inspired this next question, which is about what things do we document in history? So much of it is names, dates, big events, but I'm always thinking about the details, the logistics of how people actually went about doing things, what kind of disagreements and conflicts they had. So does this information exist? Is there something about the way we traditionally document our history that favors certain information and perspectives over others?
Well, it's history is written by the people who write it down, right? So if you're not keeping journals and diaries and, talking about these issues that happened within movements or within your network, then how are people going to know about it? Yeah, the dates and the names of big events are easy because they're usually published somewhere. But yeah, getting into the nitty-gritty and the real story, sometimes these are published in the anarchist presses, or if you look in the letters to the editor, you'll find some back and forth dialogues about issues that affect smaller communities. But it's pretty hard to get some of those stories unless you can interview people, and then of course you have different people having different agendas, and they might not remember everything that is relevant. So I think that's the case with a lot of history, is just not all of those stories are not necessarily well documented.
I think from my perspective, certainly there are those moments in which our conflicts are certainly more notable, because I think oftentimes we have a tendency to air our dirty laundry. I know looking at the history of the Anarchist Black Cross, certainly in the last couple of decades, haven't shirked at the opportunity to make a lot of our criticisms or a lot of our conflicts. We certainly have no problems making those known, oftentimes in terms of public criticism and whatnot. I think in terms of the issues of logistics and how we build, I think that's a little bit harder to sort of very much in support of what Julie's saying. I think it's a lot harder to sort of obtain because, the ingredients of how, the instructions of how we make the cake or how we build that movement, I think is sometimes not one of those things that we have a habit of writing it down, unless you're somebody who sort of thinks like an organizer rather than activist, somebody who wants to make sure that, how we built this movement and the methods, the tactics, the strategies that we used are useful and need to be put down. I think for the most part, those are things that are a little bit more difficult to find.
So since June 11th is about keeping memory and helping to keep the connection between our comrades behind bars and movements outside, often drawing our energy into prisons to support the ongoing work and organizing that our friends are doing, it's this connection between the past and what we consider the present. It's obviously not the past for Marius, when Marius is coordinating either the Day in Solidarity with trans prisoners or even his medical needs behind bars. This is an opportunity for people on the outside to be drawn into the struggle that our comrades are engaged in. For folks wanting to strengthen those connections to struggle as it existed in the past and struggle as we see it today, how do we find what we need? How do we dig into the historical record, or how do we keep those memories alive? There's so much history, there's so much to read, and how do we find the right things? How do we get the right stuff into the hands of the people who could use it?
That is a tough question because there is so much, and I myself am overwhelmed by the amount of information there is out there, and how I just don't have time to read or listen to everything I want to listen to. I do listen to a lot of podcasts, and because I just don't have time to sit down and read a lot of books, so it takes me longer to do that. But what I will say is that I found a good podcast that I like and I listen to because I trust the people that are on it, and I trust their sense of history and what they're saying and their recommendations for what to read. And what they talk about is the Green and Red podcast I really like a lot. And of course, The Final Straw and, some of the few that are out there. But it's hard to share that information in a way. Like I try to tell people that, these are good sources of information, but, everybody's got their own kind of playlist and that they keep going back to. With Marius, I talk to Marius on the phone every week, and he has quite a network of people that he does correspond with. So if he hears about a book or, an article or something that he wants to read, I'll make sure I find a way to get it into his hands if possible. And and we talk a lot about issues when we talk on the phone and when we email each other. So I kind of always know, what he's thinking, what he's reading, what he's experiencing in prison. And I try to share that as much as I can with the support group and with the social media that we have for him. But that's one person, and so how do you expand that? That's the question, I guess.
So I think from my perspective, one of the things that it is critical, especially if we're talking about prisoner support and long-term prisoner support, and how do we build that connection between the past and the current movement, is really about trying to figure out ways in which the voices of those who are imprisoned, how to get those voices out and how to get those voices to be brought into the current spaces and current struggles that are going on. Because I think that for a lot of our folks that are held captive, the reality is that, they're just as passionate as they always have been. Their convictions are just as strong as they have been, more or less, to the movements that they're participate or that they were incarcerated for. So, I think one of the things that I think is imperative is trying to find ways in which we can bring those voices, bring those folks into those communities that currently exist. And I think one of the individuals that I think when he was incarcerated, who did a wonderful job in terms of trying to not only bring his voice into the movements that were going on, but also drawing a connection between what he was involved in and then the current struggles and even the historical struggles, was Daniel McGowan. Daniel did a lot of really wonderful writing, drawing those connections between his experiences of the past and what was going on current day. And I think that we need to try to do what we can to kind of foster that as much as possible. And part of that is about making sure, and just very much in line with what Julie was saying, is making sure that, those resources in terms of information about what's going on the ground is flowing into our comrades inside the prison system. Because obviously, the information that they're getting is oftentimes filtered, whether that's through corporate news or that's, corporate media, or whether or not that is just literally the filtering of information because of the prison industrial complex. But we need to try to do what we can to sort of bring those resources available to those folks. I think for the folks that are on the outside, I think trying to build that bridge between those folks that have been previously incarcerated and trying to build that bridge between them and the current communities. I think the problem that we have with that, and it's this sort of somewhat of a tangent here, but I think one of the things that is problematic is that for a lot of those folks that were longtime prisoners and who are coming out, one of the things we don't talk about is about the lack of resources that are being provided to those communities, whether that's financial or whether that's psychological support, because there's a lot of damage that takes place with those individuals that have been incarcerated, and once they come out, there's a lot of trauma that they need to kind of work through. And I think that, providing those resources to those individuals so that way they can figure out how to navigate this emerging world that they've got plucked from, and then now they're sort of being dropped back into, but then also how to build that community between those folks that are coming out to the current community, so that way the current community can have a better understanding of the struggles of those that are within the prison system.
Yeah, I agree with you about Daniel McGowan. He's done a great job. He did a great job in prison, and he's doing a great job out of prison by staying active in communities where, he falls within the legal conformance that he's allowed to do, but still remain very active and visible. I think that's quite rare, actually, because, there's a lot of institutional trauma that comes with having been a long-term prisoner. And just, the resources and you have to find work, and you're on probation for however long, and just struggling with all the changes in society coming out. And your whole network is different because, you're in a physical place that maybe, people can't access you quite as easily and can't find you, or maybe you don't want to be found. Maybe you just want to just hole up and do your, try to maintain your existence on the outside and just be with your close family and friends. So I am concerned about that with other prisoners, and with Marius facing release in the next few years as well, and how that's going to affect, everything that he's gotten used to over the years.
Yeah, and just to follow up with that, I for those of us that have done the prison support, that is one of the things that we do often see is as part of those individuals that have been released from incarceration. Oftentimes, and it's understandable, you see them sort of float away, and I'm not sure where the truth is whether or not we as a community just sort of, I don't want to say wash our hands of, but say, okay, our job is done. They're now free, so they're out to go live their lives. Whether or not it is a thing of I need to focus on me and try to build my life again and try to build my relationships with my community, with my family, and I just want to live my life. Whether or not there's some truth in the middle, I think there's some truth in one space and some truth in the other. But I do think that one of the things that we don't provide is really sort of resources for those individuals that have now come out. Not as much as I think that we should. And so, you're absolutely right. We've got individuals who are, on the verge of getting out, and we need to make sure that we certainly have those resources to help folks. Because one thing we don't ever talk about is we don't talk about the trauma that takes place having to navigate through the prison system. We don't talk about that in any way, shape, or form, nor do we provide resources for that. And I think that's one of the things that our community needs to have a real honest conversation about, because I think those individuals that are coming out, I think that's one area where we haven't really, where we failed. So I think that's one of the things when we're talking about how do we get resources to people, I think that's one thing that we need to have a really honest conversation with, because I do think that there is a lot of trauma that needs to be addressed.
I guess since we're touching on this specific topic, and I think this is a really important one, are there any examples that you all see of projects or groups that are, or individuals that are doing good work in this direction of prompting folks to think about how do we support people coming out, whether they be people that have been our comrades or people that are just within society that are experiencing decarceration, that are getting out now, or a different form of incarceration through home arrest. Are there any resources or groups that you know of that are thinking well about this? Like one example for me that I can think of is that Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, I think like in 2022, founded a women's reentry house that can only, house a certain number of people, and they're specifically housing people that have been engaged in activism while inside of prison. But that seems like a really amazing project to me, not only to try to offer space for people to heal, offer resources, and also trying to keep people, if they want to be, still connected in with the movement after they've left the prison walls.
I mean, to be honest with you, most of the time where I've seen people have resources provided to them, it's been through the generosity of their family and their community, and especially in terms of finding jobs, finding employment, finding resources. That's usually what I've seen personally. I'm sure there's organizations that are out there, but none come to mind offhand. I've seen organizations, but not specifically targeted toward political prisoners or anarchist prisoners. Yeah, like you said, there's community groups and family and churches on a large part, I think. There's Facebook groups that, help with that. There's one called Helping Our Prisoners Elevate, and it's out of Detroit. And they just do a lot of networking, but, I think there is a lot of affiliation toward the Christian churches. So there's that. It's a lot harder when you don't have that kind of
community group that's already kind of established and set up and doing this kind of work. And it'd be great to have something, but again, it's hard to sustain that unless you're really dedicated to it.
What would y'all like to see in terms of active remembering and support for long-term prisoners?
Maybe some, just getting some of their stories and touching base with them as soon as they get out and talking to them and establishing some kind of a communication, ongoing communication. It might be hard based on, what we talked about earlier about the institutional trauma and what they're faced with coming out, but just maybe interviewing them, getting their stories, and maintaining some kind of support for them that they choose who they want to help with that. Maybe they have family members or friends that they want to see, that they trust and want to see involved in something like that. And then just getting a few other people involved. I mean, it doesn't have to be a whole, network. It can be like 4 or 5 people that work on this together. Just like there's, 4 or 5 people that are on Marius's support group and have been sustained on that group for, many years now. And, it seems to work, and he knows who we all are and he trusts us. So maybe just somehow maintaining that on the outside too.
I'm not sure if this sort of falls into this question, but I think one of the things that's important for the support communities to have an understanding is sort of really what happens for activists that are being dropped into the prison system and the cultures that exist within the prison system, and how to sort of survive and how to navigate spaces. And how to continue to do that in a way that reduces the possibility of harm, that reduces the possibility of trauma, and how oftentimes you have to engage in a cultural shift for that, for a lot of activists who may not have experience with the prison system are completely, absolutely ill-equipped, or I would assume are oftentimes ill-equipped to navigate those spaces. And the person that cultural shift, that individual shift that you have to engage in order to survive this new society in a way where you're able to come out on the other side trying to be somewhat who you were. And I think that a resource that would be extremely valuable, or an understanding that would, I think something that needs to take place is, how do we communicate with the community on the outside of this real reality? And, the fact that when these individuals come back out, they've spent sometimes decades in this society while trying to retain the values and the principles and the ideas in which they hold true, and everything that happened to them because of that. And, oftentimes we expect these individuals that once they come out, to come out in the same sort of way in which the community speaks and lives and interacts with each other when they've lived through this space, they've lived through this culture, this really sort of transformation that they've had to go through in order just to survive. And there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of, again, I go back to the concept of trauma. I think one of the things that we can do in terms of what I'd like to see is maybe a better understanding, or a way in which our communities of support, I'd like to see us really have a real conversation about that. And then also, how do we react to that? And how do we support them in terms of their transition back from the experience that they've navigated through? Because I think that oftentimes when we start seeing behavior that is problematic, rather than putting in the context of, what this person has endured, we put it in the context of the community in which we are currently navigating. And I think that, there's a fine line between abusive and inappropriate behavior that needs to be checked, but then also an understanding that where this person has sort of come from, and, the very fact that we need to have a better understanding and a better sort of sensitivity to their experience, and how to sort of support them in that space, rather than reacting to the behavior that is inappropriate, or whether it's issues of anger, frustration, snapping, communicate the positive communication versus negative communication. All of those things, I think, are things that we need to have a conversation about in a much more positive way. And I think that in terms of what we can do for long-term prisoners, especially those that are coming out or even those that are still currently incarcerated, we need to have conversations about how to handle those things in a much more productive way, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's all been very well said. Yeah, it's funny I guess it's funny how easily one can forget sort of the wider context and experience that someone else has had and hold them to the expectations that we would have of someone who's been living 5 doors over the whole time. Yeah, well, it's a bit of a jump, I think, thematically from where we've been going with the conversation in terms of the practical sides of prisoner support. But so I guess in closing, and as a way of bringing this kind of back to the abstract of June 11th, because although it is about specific individual prisoners, it's also about this collective memory, and it's about the movements in which people acted and the goals that we share with them. That continuation of story across generations, or even, like I said before, between the people who were doing stuff 5 years ago and the people that are doing stuff now, keeping the culture of resistance alive is super important, and that's an important part of the June 11th Memory Project. So stories and metaphors give us so much more nuance and room to explore and question and go deeper than straightforward, simple answers do sometimes. And they invigorate our hearts. They help us to make emotional connections to people that we've never met within wider anarchist culture, but in June 11th in particular, if it sparks you, where does anarchist storytelling fit in to creating and maintaining memory?
What I will say is I will say that there is value there because, again, it's about creating culture and community and shared values, right? Kind of very much on topic with what you're saying. But it's one of those things of how do we do that? And I think sometimes we live, certainly I do as somebody who has a passion for history, I live in a very sort of factual sort of mindset. But I think much can be communicated through things, not just through metaphors, but through sort of artistic expression, expression of self. I'm reminded by, the feminist movement and how they oftentimes talked about, the expression of voice and, finding your voice and finding it through various different methods and means, whether that's through poetry, whether that's through short story, whether or not it's about their own personal narrative and expressing narrative. And that was very much an important part of the feminist movement. And I think that there's a place for the anarchist movement to sort of find that as well, or even the political prisoner movement. I'm thinking of the book, Hauling Up the Morning, and how we've got various different artistic expression as a way to communicate the struggle of political prisoners. I think there's a place for the anarchist movement for that too. We've traditionally have done plays. We've traditionally have tried to find different avenues of art as a way to express, our ideas, our culture, our community. And so I do think that we can certainly use stories, whether fictional or nonfictional, or even using nonfiction and grabbing from nonfiction and using storytelling in a fictional method as a way to sort of communicate our history. I think, for example, there have been some books written about Ricardo Flores Magón that are loosely factual or loosely nonfiction, but are written in a fictional way. So I do think that there is an opportunity for us to do that and be successful at it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything I can add to it that would be worth saying, I guess. And I don't think I have anything more to add to that. That was a good answer, Matt. Thank you.
I think the only thing that I'll jump on with that is say, one of the organizations that was always very, very successful, especially using symbolism and metaphors as a way to communicate and educate principles and values, is the IWW. They were very successful in using these different methods as a way to communicate their ideas. I think, obviously there's a strong correlation between the IWW and the anarchist movement. And I think that we can be successful in sort of bringing that back into the modern day movement.
So Matt and Julie, thanks so much for bringing and sharing what is clearly a very rich experience and a deep consideration for these issues. Are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
not from my perspective.
No, I just wanted to thank you guys for the work that you're doing, and thank you for inviting us on to be part of this project.
Absolutely, I agree with Julie. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, it's been my pleasure and honor, and I hope we get to talk again in the future. If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support. And now some words from Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
Harrison Butker is a kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs NFL football team. Recently, the 28-year-old was invited to give the commencement address at Benedictine College at Atchison, Kansas, a Catholic university. In that commencement address that has since gone viral, Butker said a lot of cringeworthy stuff. To start, he expressed the belief that most of the women students receiving degrees were probably more excited about getting married and having kids. You know, because it's so safe to assume that women are more like wombs with a body surrounding it than they are brains with a body attached to it. Butker also argued that some Catholic leaders are, quote, pushing dangerous gender ideologies onto the youth of America, unquote. And he described a, quote, deadly sin of pride that has a month dedicated to it, unquote, clearly referencing Pride Month for the LGBTQ plus community. Butker also criticized Joe Biden and his administration's positions on abortion in opposing the recent rollback of Roe versus Wade. There's been overwhelming social media blowback in the wake of this commencement speech. The NFL, distancing itself, said Butker's views are not those of the NFL as an organization. Butker's teammates, Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce, both expressed that Butker's views are not their own, but that they believe Butker has a right to express them. So it appears even a hyper-masculine sport hopped up on men crushing one another cannot co-sign for Butker. More recently, in public comments at Regina Caeli Academy at Nashville, Butker referred to his commencement address and said, "It is now, over the past few days, my beliefs, or what people think I believe, have been the focus of countless discussions around the globe. At the outset, many people expressed a shocking level of hate. But as the days went on, even those who disagreed with my viewpoints shared their support for my freedom of religion." Wow. So let's start with what he said at the commencement. He thinks women getting degrees care more about marriage and babies than contributing to their fields of study. But apparently men don't fixate as much as women on marriage and babies. That's sexism, by definition. This guy is pushing the age-old conception that women are to be reduced, first and foremost, to baby factories. And contrary to Butker's later characterization, this is not Catholic teaching. Butker's comments about dangerous gender ideologies and a deadly sin of pride that has a month dedicated to it are clearly to support the marginalization of LGBTQ plus people. Also contrary to his later characterization, this is not Catholic teaching. In fact, in an interview with Nora O'Donnell on CBS, Pope Francis, when asked about LGBTQ plus issues, said himself, "Who am I to judge?" And just as an observation here, but the Catholic Church as an institution has historically been a hyper-conservative one. Butker's comments are far to the right of an institution that for centuries railed against the idea of the earth being round or the sun being the center of the universe. But more, Butker's later contextualization of his own hate speech, couched as religious expression, fits another pattern I see repeated again and again. To recount what Butker said, he said, "It is now, over the past few days, my beliefs, or what people think I believe, have been the focus of countless discussions around the globe. See what he's doing? Rather than owning the fact that he's a misogynist, homophobic turd, Butker is shifting, deflecting to the great impact his turdisms have created because of the countless discussions all over the globe. Yes, the whole world is now fixated on the bigotry of a guy who sort of plays football. And so this global wonder moment eclipses the fact that he just made the most marginalized kids in the world feel more marginalized. That he made the kids with the highest rate of suicide feel flawed and unworthy and dangerous to society. The discussions that his stupidity and thoughtlessness have spurred should be the focus, not all the people he hurt by what he said. Right? But he goes on. At the outset, many people expressed a shocking level of hate, but as the days went on, even those who disagreed with my viewpoints shared their support for my freedom of religion. Again, deflection. Many people expressed a shocking level of hate. Shocking because those people are so unreasonable for disagreeing with his bigotry and somehow expressing anger and outrage at hurtful speech that hurts real people is hate. In other words, those defending equality are hateful, not him, the guy who called LGBTQ people a deadly sin and referred to them as dangerous. But the ultimate deflection is this idea that even people who disagreed with him have now evolved to support his freedom of religion. Again, not talking about his hurtful comments, but talking about his right to be a bigot and a hater and to hide behind a dogma that his faith doesn't even embrace. This is part of a larger pattern of idiots on the far right with their hate and fear and stupidity rolling out this narrative of being a persecuted minority, that they're martyrs that everyone else is trying to silence. They're so tone deaf, they don't see that reasonable, caring people just want these morons to stop saying hurtful things that tear down vulnerable people. There's an irresponsibility in all it, like when Trump called COVID the China virus, and we saw a ridiculous increase of random violent assaults in public on Asian women. Words have power. When you use words, particularly as a celebrity, to hurt someone, to promote an agenda of marginalization and repression, that's not religion. To Harrison Butker, I say, I got a message last night directly from God. She said she doesn't even like you. I've heard responses where people say he just needs to shut up and play football, but I can't join that chorus at all. That's what was said when Ali refused the draft or when Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem. I think it's completely appropriate, even a responsibility, for athletes to use their voices to create social change. I don't want athletes to shut up. I just want idiots to shut up. Harrison Butker is an idiot. He needs to shut up. Socially and culturally, we've got it backwards. Everyone is entitled to an opinion. Belief is king. All opinions are relative. It's not true. We're not all entitled to an opinion. We're just not. This entitlement is dependent upon fulfilling a responsibility. You have to know something before you're entitled to believe something. I've been in plenty of conversations where others have asked my opinion, and I'll say, I'm not entitled to a position on that. I don't know enough. We're so focused on everyone having the right to express opinions and not on our obligations to collect facts and ponder consequences before we speak. So what we've created is a toxic environment of thought pollution, a social soup of contaminated, stagnant toilet water, where everyone gets a turn to flush their mind poop, to flow into the public discourse. We end up swimming with the turds, like Harrison Butker's commencement address. This is Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're reminded of the Baby Ruth pool scene in Caddyshack, You are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.
Promise that we'll never quit. So drunk though our hands surely woven. Entire fleets of staggering ships. Now our ships land the flows of the ocean. And the oceans breach on the ridge. And the terrified dreams of our wanderings. That once lit our way are now hid. We want punks in the palace. 'Cause punks got the loveliest dreams. And our gang is liquid and lovely. And smile and sway and lean. And burn with a care caravans of miserable pricks. There ain't none, but sometimes there is. Policemen in parallel lines, blind, blind, blind. The broken bones of quivering pines, while empty waters rise. May the light of our striving still shine. but some hearts are true, but some hearts aren't hardly true, but some hearts are true, and some hearts are true, some hearts are true, some hearts are true, some hearts are true, some hearts are true.